Chapter 1. When morning had no number. For most of human history, the beginning of the day was not announced by an alarm or a glowing screen. Instead, morning arrived as a gradual shift in the environment. Without mechanical clocks to dictate a precise numerical hour, waking was a biological and ecological response rather than a scheduled event. People attuned themselves to the subtle changes in light, temperature, and sound that accompanied the turning of the earth. Dawn temperature drops and changing natural signals could often wake people. Though this was not universally the case, sleep itself was shaped by the seasons and the architecture of early homes. In agrarian communities, the boundary between the outdoors and the indoors was permeable. Houses were built with local materials that breathed, settling into the landscape and allowing the ambient conditions to seep inside. The chill of the pre-dawn air, the shifting shadows cast by a rising sun, and the chorus of local wildlife provided the cues that the period of rest was drawing to a close. For many, waking was a slow process of matching personal rhythms to the larger rhythms of the local geography. A quiet transition marked these early hours. Before abundant artificial lighting, darkness often curtailed many activities, while daylight made outdoor and visually demanding work easier. The transition from night to day was experienced as a sequence of practical necessities. Upon waking, one of the primary tasks involved the domestic fire. Hearth care was important, especially in many cold-climate households, where maintaining the embers overnight saved the labor of striking a new spark in the morning. However, this was never an always applicable rule, as warmer regions and nomadic cultures interacted with fire in their own distinct ways. Where the hearth was central, the morning routine began with the careful revival of the fire. Ash was swept back to reveal the glowing coals preserved from the night before. Fresh kindling was laid, and breath was used to coax the embers back into a steady flame. This act of rekindling the hearth served multiple purposes. It provided warmth against the morning chill, it offered a source of light before the sun fully cleared the horizon, and it allowed for the preparation of the morning meal. The smell of wood smoke was one of the defining sensory signatures of early morning life. With the fire established, attention turned to the immediate demands of the household and the surrounding land. For agricultural families, morning was defined by a specific sequence of chores. Livestock required feeding, milking, or turning out to pasture. Water had to be drawn from a well, a stream, or a communal fountain. These tasks were not governed by a schedule measured in minutes, but by the logical order of necessity. Animals signaled their hunger, and crops demanded attention based on the weather and the season. The concept of time in this era was task-oriented. People did not think of their work as taking a certain number of hours. Rather, a task took as long as it needed to take. The length of the morning was determined by the volume of chores and the speed at which they could be accomplished before the sun reached its zenith. This created a fluid experience of time, where the pace of life expanded and contracted in harmony with the natural world and the shifting lengths of daylight throughout the year. During the summer months, mornings were long and began early. The extended daylight allowed for a significant amount of labor to be completed before the heat of the afternoon set in. Conversely, winter mornings were compressed. The delayed sunrise and the bitter cold restricted early outdoor activity, naturally altering the rhythm of the household. People slept longer, and the tasks of the morning were often confined to indoor maintenance and craft work. The seasons dictated the structure of the day, making rigid consistency an illogical goal. Even in urban centers, where trade and commerce structured daily life, the morning retained this organic quality. Craftsmen and merchants began their work when there was sufficient light to see their materials. Marketplaces came alive as vendors set up their stalls, their activities coordinated by the rising sun and the arrival of goods from the countryside. The sounds of the city waking up, the clatter of carts, the calls of street vendors, the opening of shutters, served as an auditory clock for the residents. This urban ecosystem still relied heavily on the shifting environmental indicators to dictate its pace. As societies grew more complex, there emerged a desire to impose a more unified structure on the day. The early attempts to measure time were still deeply connected to the natural world. Sundials provided a visual representation of the sun's passage, dividing the daylight into hours. However, these hours were unequal, stretching in the summer and shrinking in the winter. Water clocks and hourglasses offered a way to measure duration independently of the sun, but they required constant attention and resetting, making them impractical for coordinating large populations across broad distances. The most notable development in communal timekeeping came from religious institutions. In medieval Europe, the monastic tradition required monks to gather for prayer at specific intervals throughout the day and night. To ensure regularity, monasteries began to use bells to signal the canonical hours. The sound of the monastery bell ringing out across the surrounding countryside provided a shared auditory framework for the local population. It began to replace the silence of the dawn with a deliberate human signal. The ringing of the morning bell, often called matins or prime, became a recognizable marker for the start of the day. It told the farmers in the fields and the artisans in the towns that the morning had officially begun. Yet, even this system remained tethered to the natural world. The timing of the bells was often adjusted according to the sunrise and sunset, maintaining a connection to the seasonal rhythms. The bell provided a structure, but it was a flexible one, echoing the fluidity of the agrarian lifestyle. People integrated these chimes into existing routines, rather than altering their lives to fit a strict grid. The transition from task-oriented time to abstract, measured time was a slow evolution. The bells organized the community, but they did not divide the morning into minute increments. People still experienced the early hours through the lens of their work and their environment. The morning was the space between waking and the midday meal, a block of time defined by the completion of essential duties, rather than the ticking of a mechanism. It was a lived experience, firmly embedded in the physical reality of the local world. And humbers of mandand, as pumperiva mikid of a humban spulam fum shormind, or when nivon beamand stay than dent and pumping became apparent. The fluid hours of the sundial and the seasonal adjustments of the monastery bell began to clash with the demands of coordinated commerce and travel. A new way of organizing the day was slowly emerging, one that would eventually separate time from the movement of the sun and the changing of the seasons. The shift would require a new technology, a machine capable of producing a steady, independent rhythm. The concept of an hour would need to be untethered from the daylight and standardized into a fixed unit of duration. This change would alter how people structured their mornings and their work. The dawn would continue to bring the light, and in households where a hearth was central, the morning chill might still prompt the rekindling of the fire. But the way people understood those early hours was on the verge of a significant transformation. The natural cues that had guided human activity for millennia were about to be supplemented by the steady rhythm of the mechanical clock. This shift marks the beginning of a new era, where morning would no longer be defined solely by the sun, but by the numbers on a dial. Chapter 2. Reading the moving sun. Humanity's earliest awareness of time was bound to the cycles of light and dark. For generations, the rising and setting of the sun provided all the structure a community required. Morning was for beginning work, evening was for rest. Yet, as societies grew more complex, the need to divide the daylight hours became apparent. The arc of the sun across the sky offered a natural solution. By observing how shadows lengthened and shortened, early observers realized that the daylight itself could be mapped. The sun was a steady reference point, a prominent feature of the daytime sky that offered a shared framework for a local population. The earliest timekeeping required no complex machinery, only a keen eye and an object to cast a shadow. A simple stick driven into the earth, known as a gnomon, transformed the ground into a rudimentary clock face. As the sun rose in the east, the gnomon cast a long shadow stretching westward. As morning progressed into afternoon, the shadow shrank, rotating northward or southward depending on the hemisphere, before lengthening again toward the east as the sun sank below the horizon. This predictable sweep allowed early peoples to break the daylight into manageable segments. Among the earliest and visually striking developments in solar timekeeping were the monumental obelisks of ancient Egypt. Securely attested in Egypt from the Old Kingdom, by the 3rd millennium BCE, these towering stone pillars served multiple civic and religious functions. While they were monuments to the pharaohs and the sun god Ra, their imposing presence also served a practical meteorological and temporal purpose. When sunlight struck the tall, tapered granite, it cast a clear, dark line across the surrounding plaza. Instead of reading hours with the precision we expect today, these shadows could indicate broad portions or seasons. The long shadows of winter contrasted with the shorter shadows of summer, allowing observant priests and architects to track the solar year. By marking where the shadow fell at different times, the Egyptians could organize their civic and religious duties. The layout around these monuments was practical, while the specific paving stones have long since worn away or been replaced. The flat, open courtyards surrounding the obelisks provided an ideal surface for tracking the sun's daily path. The shadow acted as a moving pointer, drifting across the stone. For an observer familiar with the monument's shadow, it could offer a broad indication of the sun's progress. It was a shared visual reference. The obelisk gathered the local community under a single, observable metric of the sun's progress, anchoring the sprawling city to the rhythms of the cosmos without imposing strict rigidities on the populace. As observers charted these moving shadows, one daily event stood out with particular clarity: the moment when the shadow reached its shortest length. This occurred when the sun reached its highest elevation in the sky, a point we now call solar noon. Solar noon is a useful approximate midpoint, never flawless or perfect. The Earth's elliptical orbit and axial tilt mean that the exact duration between one solar noon and the next varies slightly throughout the year. For ancient timekeepers, however, this variation was largely imperceptible and irrelevant to their daily needs. Solar noon provided a reliable pivot point, bisecting the daylight into two recognizable halves, the hours of ascending sun and the hours of descending sun. This midpoint could help structure labor rather than dictating it. In agricultural and early urban settings, knowing that the sun had crossed its zenith was a practical cue. It signaled a time for the midday meal, a brief respite from the harshest heat, or the transition to a different phase of the day's tasks. It did not impose a strict, unyielding schedule on the workers. Instead, it offered a gentle environmental prompt that helped communities coordinate their efforts. The rhythm was natural, flexible, and tied directly to the physical experience of the local environment. The identification of solar noon also laid the groundwork for more detailed subdivisions of the day. Once the midpoint was established, the periods before and after could be halved, and halved again, eventually leading to the concept of hours. These early hours, however, were unequal, because the amount of daylight changes with the seasons, stretching long in the summer and shrinking in the winter. The length of a solar hour expanded and contracted accordingly. A summer hour was long and leisurely, while a winter hour was short and fleeting. This elasticity of time reflects a worldview embedded in the natural cycles of the Earth. People lived in harmony with the shifting seasons, adjusting their habits and expectations to match the available light, rather than trying to force the light to match a mechanical grid. The principles observed by the Egyptians and other early cultures gradually spread across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Greeks adopted the mnemon and began to refine the geometry of shadows, developing more sophisticated sundials that could track the seasonal variations with greater accuracy. They constructed bowls and intricate planar surfaces to capture the shadow, etching lines that accounted for the sun's shifting declination. The Romans, in turn, adopted these devices, placing sundials in public forums, private villas, and civic centers. The proliferation of sundials changed how societies organized themselves, though it is important to view this shift through a practical lens. The sundial was a tool for coordination, not a rigid overseer. In Rome, the public sundial allowed magistrates to schedule assemblies, merchants to plan their market hours, and citizens to meet with greater reliability. Pliny the Elder recorded the arrival of an early public sundial in Rome, noting how it gradually shifted the culture of the city toward a more synchronized existence. Yet, this synchronization remained local and deeply tied to the physical environment. Each sundial was calibrated to its specific latitude. A sundial built for Rome would be inaccurate if moved to Alexandria or Athens. Time was a geographic reality, rooted in the specific relationship between a local place and the sun overhead. There was no universal standard, no single temporal grid imposed upon the broader world. The time in one city was naturally different from the time in a neighboring city further east or west. This localism meant that early timekeeping retained an organic connection to the landscape. The shadow on the dial was a direct translation of the local sky, a conversation between the sun and the specific patch of earth where the dial was placed. Despite its elegance and widespread adoption, solar timekeeping possessed a distinct vulnerability. It was reliant on clear skies. When heavy clouds rolled in, or when the rainy season arrived, the shadow vanished, and the structured divisions of the day faded back into ambiguity. More obviously, the sundial was rendered useless every evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night remained an uncharted expanse, a period where the steady rhythm of the shadow could not follow. As societies continued to grow, the demand for a continuous, uninterrupted measure of time began to emerge. A tool was needed that could track the hours through storms and darkness alike, severing the measurement of time from the immediate presence of the sun. To find such a steady, independent rhythm, engineers and inventors would have to look away from the sky and turn their attention toward the slow, measured flow of terrestrial elements. Water, rather than light, would provide the next step in capturing the hours. guiding civilization into a new era of timekeeping that ticked steadily through the darkest nights. Chapter 3: The Unequal Hours. Once early observers established the boundaries of dawn, the midpoint of solar noon, and the fading light of dusk, the next practical step was dividing the intervening daylight into smaller, named portions. The solution they adopted would govern human timekeeping for millennia. Rather than fixing a unit of time to a strict, unvarying duration, ancient societies chose to divide the visible daylight into 12 equal segments. Because the amount of daylight shifts with the seasons, these 12 segments were inherently flexible. They stretched during the long days of summer and compressed during the short days of winter. This system created what historians call seasonal, temporal, or unequal hours. The choice of 12 was not arbitrary. It emerged from the mathematical and astronomical traditions of the ancient Near East. The Babylonians, building upon earlier Sumerian mathematics, utilized a sexagesimal system based on the number 60, which heavily influenced early astronomical calculations. Furthermore, 12 roughly corresponds to the number of lunar cycles in a solar year, providing a useful mathematical anchor for cultures observing the night sky. The Egyptians adopted this division, tracking groups of stars called decans to split the night into 12 parts, and eventually applying the same 12-part division to the daylight. This created the 24-hour cycle we recognize today, with a crucial difference. For the ancients, the hours of the day and the hours of the night were separate entities, governed by different rules and constantly changing in opposition to one another across the year. To understand the physical mechanics of the unequal hour, one must look at the shifting seasons. Twice a year, at the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, the Earth experiences roughly 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. On these specific days, the daytime hours and the nighttime hours are equal. As the Earth continues its orbit and its axis tilts toward the summer solstice, the period of daylight expands. In the Mediterranean latitudes of Greece and Italy, the 12 hours of daylight were stretched across a much longer span of actual time. During the height of midsummer, a single daytime hour in Rome would be equivalent to roughly 75 modern minutes. A citizen going about their business in the Forum would experience a slow, lingering progression of the shadow across the sundial. Conversely, as the year waned and approached the winter solstice, the period of daylight shrank. The same 12 hours had to be fitted into a much shorter window of sunlight. In the depths of December, a single daytime hour in that same Mediterranean latitude would last only about 45 modern minutes. The hour was therefore not a fixed container of time, but a proportional fraction of the available light. It was a fluid concept, expanding and contracting in a slow, annual rhythm that mirrored the physical environment of the changing seasons. This flexible system provided a practical framework that naturally aligned with the agrarian year. It offered a structure for activity that expanded when there was sufficient light to work and contracted when the sun set early. It is tempting to view this system as a biological match, but we should avoid claiming that seasonal hours perfectly matched human endurance. The physical toll of laboring through the extended 75-minute hours of a scorching July day remained heavy, and the exhaustion of the harvest was real regardless of how the sundial divided the afternoon. The unequal hours did not ease the burden of work, but they did ensure that the social and economic organization of the day matched the environmental reality of the sky. The measurement of these hours relied on a mathematical understanding of the sun's passage. Formal seasonal hours were astronomical, calculated by the true horizon and the geometric arc of the sun. The immediate topography of the local landscape did not dictate the formal length of the hour. The mathematics of latitude and the seasons did. The defining anchor of this system remained the moment the sun crossed the local meridian, reaching its highest point in the sky. This event always marked the end of the 6th hour and the beginning of the 7th. Regardless of whether it was a long summer day or a short winter one, the 6th hour always concluded at solar noon, neatly dividing the 12 hours into 6 morning segments and 6 afternoon segments. Living within this framework shaped the daily routines of the ancient and medieval worlds. Ordinary people and civic institutions referenced these hours to coordinate their activities. The day began at the first hour with the sunrise. The third hour, roughly mid-morning, often signaled the opening of markets, the gathering of civic assemblies, or the beginning of legal proceedings. The 6th hour marked the midday pause, a time for rest and the main meal to escape the heat. The 9th hour indicated the mid-afternoon, and the 12th hour brought the daylight to a close. These markers were sufficient to guide the flow of commerce, the scheduling of law courts, and the deployment of military guards. The culture of time in this era was accommodating. Because the hours were fluid and timepieces like sundials were not carried in every pocket, people coordinated their lives without strict reliance on tiny fractions of time. Minute, specific deadlines were less common outside some institutions, such as monasteries regulating prayer or specific guilds managing shared resources. For most individuals, arriving around the third hour was sufficient for a meeting, a market transaction, or a social visit. There was a natural margin of error built into the fabric of society, a leniency that stemmed from the shared understanding that time was a variable element of the natural world. The unequal hours dominated the Mediterranean and Europe for centuries, heavily influencing the design of solar timepieces. Sundials were specifically calibrated to display these curving, shifting lines. A well-crafted sundial did not just show the current hour, it mapped the sun's changing trajectory across the year. The shadow traced a path that naturally accommodated the shifting seasons, moving across the network of lines to visually represent the expanding and contracting hours. A citizen glancing at a public dial saw a direct translation of the sky's geometry, a continuous reminder of where the community stood within the solar year. This system of temporal hours was deeply ingrained in the culture, surviving the fall of empires and the rise of new religious orders. When the early Christian church established its canonical hours for prayer, it adopted the terminology of the Roman civil day. Prime, terce, sext, and none corresponded directly to the first, third, sixth, and ninth hours of the unequal day. The rhythm of the shifting hours was woven into the spiritual life of the continent, dictating when bells would ring and when voices would rise in chant. Yet, the unequal hour system contained a significant practical limitation. It was a system built on the visible presence of the sun. Society also required a way to track these shifting hours through the darkness of night, or behind the thick stone walls of a temple where shadows could not reach. The challenge for ancient engineers was to create an artificial device that could replicate the variable pace of the seasonal hours. They needed an instrument that could mimic the stretching of the summer daylight and the compression of the winter afternoon, translating the complex geometry of the sky into a controlled, measurable process indoors. This demand would lead them to capture the flow of time in a vessel, measuring the hours drop by careful drop. Chapter 4. Time shared by sound. For much of early human history, determining the time of day was a visual exercise. A person had to look at the sky to judge the sun's position or consult a sundial. This worked well enough for an individual managing tasks under a clear sky, but presented a logistical challenge for a growing community. Visual timekeepers were geographically fixed and useless in the dark or during foul weather. To coordinate a larger population, societies needed a method to broadcast time over walls, across fields, and through the night. Sound provided an effective solution. By translating the measurement of an hour into a resonant strike, time became a public event rather than a private observation. The systematic use of sound to organize daily life took firm root within the monastic communities of early medieval Europe. The Christian Church inherited the Roman system of unequal hours and adapted it into the divine office, a daily schedule of prayers. Monks were required to gather in the chapel at specific intervals, including periods long before dawn. In sprawling abbeys, brothers might be scattered across scriptoriums, gardens, and workshops. They needed a reliable signal to drop their tools and assemble. The solution was the heavy bronze bell, suspended high in a tower designed to carry its tone over the landscape. The casting of a large bell was a major technological and financial undertaking. Bronze had to be carefully smelted in a furnace and poured into a mold buried deep in the earth. If successful, the resulting bell was hauled into the belfry using wooden windlasses and thick hemp ropes. A designated monk, often the sacristan, bore the responsibility of keeping the time and operating this massive instrument. He watched the movement of the stars on clear nights or utilized early indoor timekeepers to measure the passing of the dark. The physical labor of ringing these bells was significant, often requiring the sacristan to throw his entire body weight onto the rope to swing the heavy metal sufficiently to strike the internal iron clapper. The daily schedule included matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, prime in the early morning, followed by terce, sext, none, vespers at sunset, and compline before retiring. When the appointed hour arrived, the sacristan pulled the rope. The strike echoed across the cloister and out into the surrounding countryside, a heavy sound that carried for miles. Many listeners shared a signal. The tolling of the bell structured the spiritual day, serving as an auditory framework that told the monastic community when to pray, when to eat, and when to sleep. It bound the isolated monks together through a shared acoustic experience. The secular world quickly recognized the utility of this acoustic signaling. As towns and cities expanded during the High Middle Ages, civic leaders saw the value in organizing their growing populations. The municipal bell tower emerged as a counterpart to the church spire, becoming a central feature of the urban landscape. In regions like Flanders and northern Italy, the construction of a secular belfry, or beffroi, was a powerful declaration of a town's political independence from the local lord or bishop. These towers were built tall, dominating the skyline, and housed a variety of bells, each with a specific civic function. A large bell could coordinate activity across a settlement, reaching laborers in workshops and merchants in counting houses. Municipal bells structured the working day and maintained civic order. In walled towns, a specific bell signaled the opening of the heavy wooden gates at dawn, allowing carts of produce, lumber, and livestock to flow in from the surrounding farms and hamlets. At dusk, another ringing warned travelers that the gates were closing, securing the town against the night. Hearing this evening bell from a distance meant a frantic rush toward the walls before the heavy doors swung shut until dawn. Another prominent auditory marker was the curfew bell, derived from the French phrase couvre-feu, meaning to cover the fire. In densely packed urban centers built largely of timber, an unattended hearth was a catastrophic risk. The curfew bell instructed residents to bank their fires and retire, a safety measure organized through shared sound. These signals created a rhythm that guided the urban population without requiring citizens to own a personal timepiece. Commerce relied heavily on these shared signals to maintain order and fairness. Market bells aimed to regulate access to goods, ensuring trade was conducted openly under the supervision of local authorities. The market square was the economic heart of the town, a crowded space filled with temporary stalls and wooden benches. Farmers brought carts loaded with vegetables, butchers displayed cuts of meat, and artisans laid out hand tools and woven textiles. In a busy trading center, officials worked to prevent practices like forestalling, where a wealthy merchant might intercept farmers outside the town and buy up all the grain or wool before it reached the open market, inflating prices for others. To combat this, towns enacted strict rules governing when transactions could occur. A specific market bell would ring to announce that trading was permitted to begin. Before the bell sounded, no goods could legally change hands. This system ensured that buyers and sellers started negotiating within the same broad window of time. Local residents were often given the first opportunity to purchase basic necessities like food, and only after a second bell rang were outside traders allowed to buy goods in bulk for export. The bell organized the commercial day and provided a structure that supported local regulations. It offered a practical method for managing a crowded marketplace, substituting a shared sound for a shared clock. The reliance on acoustics also shaped the physical security of the town. During the night, watchmen patrolled the unlit, winding streets, calling out the hours to reassure sleeping residents that the watch was active and the town was safe. This vocal broadcasting of time was a more intimate, human form of coordination. A watchman's voice echoing down a narrow alley provided a rough estimate of the night's progress, a comforting sound in an era when darkness held genuine threats. The acoustic landscape of a medieval city was a complex language of strikes, chimes, and shouts that residents learned to interpret from childhood. However, all these acoustic methods, whether a massive bronze bell or the shout of a watchman, relied heavily on human vigilance. A person had to decide when it was time to pull the rope or call the hour. This reliance introduced a natural margin of error. A sacristan might fall asleep in the cold hours before matins, a watchman might be distracted by a disturbance, or a sudden storm might obscure the stars they used for astronomical reference. Human fatigue and human judgment meant that the acoustic broadcast was often irregular. The intervals between the bells could stretch or compress depending on the attentiveness of the person holding the rope. To ring a bell accurately, the timekeeper first needed an accurate measure of the passing time themselves. Chanting a fixed number of psalms provided a rough internal gauge, but it was hardly precise. In the dark of the night, or during a heavy overcast day when shadows failed, the human timekeeper required an instrument that operated independently of the sky. They needed a device that could silently track the duration between the strikes, without requiring constant human attention. The pursuit of this steady, independent measurement led engineers to look past the sun and the stars, seeking a physical substance whose controlled flow could replicate the forward motion of time. They turned their attention to the careful, measured movement of liquids. Chapter 5. A day made of tasks. While bells rang from municipal towers and monastic spires to coordinate the broader movements of early communities, the internal rhythm of ordinary life often relied on a different measure. Before abstract, numerical time dictated the day, human experience was shaped by the duration of the work itself. Historians and anthropologists refer to this as task-oriented time. It is a way of living where the clock is not an external dial mounted on a wall, but the physical completion of a necessary core. To live in a task-oriented society is to measure the day not in theoretical hours or minutes, but in furrows ploughed, wool spun, wood chopped, or water drawn from a well. The focus remains steadily on the material reality of the environment, the shifting seasons, and the physical limits of the human body. In a world governed by tasks, time is not perceived as an empty container waiting to be filled with activity. Instead, the activity itself provides the measure of time. The day is structured by a logical sequence of necessities. A farmer does not begin the morning with the goal of working for a set number of hours. Rather, the day begins with the immediate needs of the livestock and ends when the animals are secured for the night. If the harvest is ripe and a storm is approaching, the work continues until the crop is safely stored or until physical exhaustion forces a halt. The pace of life naturally expands and contracts in harmony with the weather and the available daylight. There is little sense of wasting time in the modern sense, because time is bound to the physical world. When the required tasks are completed, the remaining daylight is simply lived, rather than accounted for. In the agrarian world, the landscape itself served as a visual record of time spent and labor exerted. A prominent historical example of this relationship between land, work, and time is the concept of the acre. In medieval Europe, an acre was traditionally associated with the amount of land a single yoke of oxen could plough in one day. It provided a useful conceptual shorthand for a day's heavy labor, helping communities estimate the effort required to prepare a field for sowing. However, the actual daily progress of a ploughman and his team varied significantly. A heavy, waterlogged clay field would take much longer to turn than a stretch of light, sandy loam. A hillside presented greater challenges than a flat meadow. A broken ploughshare could slow the work to a crawl. Yet, despite these daily variations in effort, the acre remained a fixed unit of physical area, offering a standard measurement for taxation and land distribution. The physical size of the acre did not shrink or expand to match the labor required. Instead, agricultural workers adjusted their expectations of how much energy a specific, fixed acre would demand. During the late summer harvest, tasks required maximizing every minute of daylight, while deep winter brought a necessary deceleration, shifting the focus to indoor maintenance as the frozen ground brought field labor to a standstill. Beyond the fields, other trades adopted similar task-based metrics. A weaver might measure the morning by the length of cloth produced on the loom. A blacksmith might gauge the afternoon by the number of horseshoes forged. The work provided its own internal rhythm, marked by the steady clack of the shuttle or the rhythmic ringing of the hammer on the anvil. These repetitive actions created a localized sense of time that was distinct from the striking of the town bell. The task was considered finished when the object met the accepted standard of quality, not when a specific hour was struck. This localized time allowed for a degree of autonomy. The worker controlled the pace, taking breaks when physical exertion demanded it, and accelerating the effort when materials required swift action, such as striking iron while it held the correct heat. In many urban centers, local trade guilds reinforced this connection between daylight, tasks, and quality by explicitly forbidding night work. Working by the dim light of a tallow candle was thought to produce inferior goods and increased fire risks, legally tethering the artisan's productive time directly to the reliable presence of the sun. Inside the domestic sphere, time was similarly anchored to the physical processes of household survival. The hearth was a center of continuous activity, and food preparation required its own practical methods of measurement. Boiling an egg, simmering a stew, or baking loaves of bread demanded a keen sense of duration. Without minute hands or kitchen timers, cooks relied heavily on sensory cues. They watched for the color of the crust to turn golden brown, listened for the sound of boiling water, and smelled the roasting meat to judge its progress. In some traditions, specific recited prayers were occasionally used as rough timers for culinary tasks. A recipe manuscript might instruct a cook to boil a herbal mixture for the duration of 3 paternosters or a Hail Mary. However, these recited prayers were not exact chronometers, nor were they common in all households or cultures. They served as approximate, accessible guides, leveraging the repetitive structures of daily spiritual life to estimate a short span of time. The bread was considered ready when it sounded hollow tapped on the bottom, a physical test superseding any abstract count. Beyond the kitchen, tasks like spinning yarn or mending clothes occupied the margins of the day, utilizing residual heat and light in an unhurried progression of domestic upkeep. The boundaries of this task-oriented day were gently set by the natural limits of human energy and the fading of the daylight. When the sun went down and the visual chores were finished, the household naturally transitioned toward rest. Sleep in this era was closely tied to these organic rhythms. The evening routine involved banking the fire, securing the doors, and settling into the quiet darkness. Waking up was usually a gradual process, prompted by the increasing light of dawn filtering through the shutters, the morning calls of livestock, or the shifting temperatures of the early air. Waking could be influenced by daylight, household activity, animals, work demands, and individual sleep patterns. The disruptions common to modern mornings, with sudden alarms ending sleep in the dark, were largely absent from typical agrarian life. Rest was viewed as a restorative necessity, following the heavy physical toll of the day's labor, rather than a rigidly scheduled block of hours to be strictly managed. This fluid, gentle transition between waking and sleeping harmonized well with the broader, flexible nature of a task-oriented existence, allowing communities to live in close synchronization with the natural world around them. This task-based approach provided a cohesive, intuitive structure for daily life across centuries. It allowed farming communities and craftspeople to work in rhythm with the seasons, the weather, and the practical demands of their physical environment. Yet, as societies grew more complex, the limitations of task-oriented time became increasingly apparent. A physical chore could not reliably coordinate an event taking place later in the dark, nor could it synchronize the activities of scholars, astronomers, or night watchmen who needed to measure intervals without engaging in manual labor. The quiet, watchful nights and the rigid monastic schedules required a method of tracking time that flowed independently of human effort or natural light. Observers sought a mechanism offering a steady, uninterrupted count, divorced from the ploughing of a field, the forging of iron, or the boiling of a pot. To achieve this continuous measurement in the absence of the sun, ancient thinkers observed how a controlled liquid could measure passing hours in silence. Chapter 6. Water that counted in silence. For millennia, human beings looked upward to know the hour. The sun and stars provided a grand celestial clockwork, yet this majestic system possessed one glaring limitation. It was rendered useless by a simple cloud, and it offered no help during the dark hours of night. To measure time independent of the sky, ancient engineers turned their attention downward, to the earth and its elements. They sought a substance that could mimic the steady, continuous progression of time itself. They found their answer in water. The water clock, or clepsydra, meaning water thief in Greek, emerged as a sophisticated timekeeping instrument of the ancient world. Unlike a sundial capturing a shadow cast by the sun, the clepsydra measured time through the physical accumulation or depletion of liquid. It was a significant conceptual leap. Time was no longer just an astronomical phenomenon. It was treated as a physical volume that could be contained, channeled, and quantified. Water, however, is a complex substance to control. To tame it into a reliable metric required generations of patient observation and mechanical refinement. The earliest iterations were simple, but over centuries the clepsydra evolved into an instrument of considerable complexity, incorporating gears, floats, and intricate displays. Yet, beneath every gilded automaton and mechanical bird lay the same core principle: the steady pull of gravity on a fluid. The earliest surviving examples of these silent timekeepers point to the courts of ancient Egypt. Around the 16th century BCE, during the reign of Amenhotep I, Egyptian artisans crafted elegant alabaster vessels designed to measure the hours of the night. These early outflow clocks took the form of conical bowls with a tiny perforation near the base. As water slowly bled from the hole, the water level inside the bowl descended, gradually revealing a series of inscribed markings on the interior wall. Each mark corresponded to a specific hour. It was an intuitive system, yet it required an understanding of fluid dynamics, even if the ancients did not possess modern mathematical equations to express it. The conical shape of the Egyptian vessels was a deliberate engineering solution. As the vessel emptied, the weight of the water, and therefore the pressure forcing it through the aperture, decreased. A straight-sided cylinder would drain rapidly at first, and then sluggishly toward the end. The vessel's shape and seasonally calibrated, unevenly spaced markings helped users interpret the changing outflow as the water level fell. Simultaneously, astronomers in Babylon were developing their own liquid chronometers. Babylonian clay tablets detail the use of cylindrical water clocks, often employed to time the watches of the night, or to regulate the allocation of water for irrigation. Rather than reading marks on a vessel, Babylonian timekeepers frequently measured the volume or weight of the water that had escaped. correlating liquid mass directly with the passage of temporal units. The mass of the water provided a tangible metric for the passing of a night watch. As scientific inquiry shifted toward the Hellenistic world, Greek and Roman engineers inherited the clepsydra's basic premise and elevated its mechanical design. It was during this era that a notable mechanical shift occurred, the transition from outflow clocks to inflow clocks. Rather than measuring the water leaving a vessel, Hellenistic engineers measured the water entering a receiving tank. This minor inversion solved several mechanical headaches, provided the flow rate into the tank could be made regular. To achieve this, inventors like Ctesibius of Alexandria, working in the 3rd century BCE, introduced the concept of the feedback loop. He utilized an intermediate reservoir, equipped with an overflow spout. By feeding more water into this middle chamber than could drain into the measuring tank, the water level within remained largely steady. Consequently, the pressure at its drainage hole varied much less, yielding a more regular drip. With a steady flow established, Ctesibius and his contemporaries expanded the clock's capabilities. The rising water in the lower tank supported a cork float. As the hours passed and the float ascended, it was attached to a rack and pinion mechanism that rotated a cylinder or moved a pointer across a dial. Some Hellenistic clepsydras featured automated figures that sounded gongs, dropped pebbles into brass bowls, or raised trumpets. Despite these theatrical flourishes, the core scientific achievement was the stabilization of the flow rate. The Romans adopted these devices enthusiastically, installing water clocks in public squares and using smaller, portable versions to regulate speeches in the law courts. If a speaker was allotted a certain amount of time, a clepsydra was filled accordingly. When the water ran out, the speech had to end. Justice was meted out by the drop. Following the Western Roman Empire's collapse, the water clock's technological lineage bifurcated. In Western Europe, the knowledge of complex gearing and feedback systems faded. But the basic outflow clepsydra survived within the stone walls of Christian monasteries. Monks required a dependable method to rouse themselves for nocturnal prayers, matins and lauds, before the sun offered guidance. Simple water drip mechanisms were employed to slowly fill a bucket over several cold hours. Once the bucket reached a critical weight, it tripped a lever that struck a bell, breaking the monastic silence and calling the sleepy brothers to the chapel. This basic alarm system was essential for maintaining the rigid schedule of the divine office during the long winter nights. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the sophisticated engineering traditions of Alexandria were preserved and vastly expanded upon. Engineers, such as Al-Jazari, working in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, constructed monumental water clocks that demonstrated remarkable mechanical skill. His castle clock in Anatolia stood over 10 feet tall, utilizing a complex network of floats, pulleys, and falling weights regulated by a carefully engineered water flow mechanism. It displayed celestial features, tracking the simulated orbits of the sun and moon, and operated automata, including mechanical musicians that played at specific intervals to entertain the court. For Islamic scholars, the water clock was a utilitarian device for regulating prayer times and a demonstration of mechanical philosophy. It represented an intellectual effort to decode the mathematical order of the cosmos and to replicate the steady march of time within the physical confines of a terrestrial machine. Yet, despite the ingenuity of Ctesibius, Al-Jazari, and the artisans who spent lifetimes wrestling with fluid dynamics, the medium of the clepsydra harbored inherent, practical limitations. Water remains highly sensitive to its physical environment. As the seasons turned, the physical characteristics of the liquid itself shifted. In the heat of a Mediterranean summer, water inevitably evaporated from open measuring reservoirs. This evaporation altered the carefully calibrated water levels and flow dynamics, causing the clocks to run slowly or become unreliable. Conversely, during the chill of a northern European winter, the temperature of the stored water plummeted, noticeably increasing its viscosity. The sluggish, chilled water flowed more reluctantly through narrow apertures, causing the clock to drag its feet. In conditions of extreme cold, the mechanism faced severe damage as the water froze solid, potentially expanding and cracking the inner chambers of the timekeeper. Furthermore, the water available to ancient engineers was rarely pure. Over time, microscopic algae thrived in the stagnant holding tanks. Mineral deposits from hard water gradually calcified around the meticulously drilled drainage holes, slowly narrowing the aperture and choking the flow to a trickle. Maintenance became a constant, grueling battle against organic growth and sedimentation. To achieve a truly autonomous, climate-proof timekeeper, clockmakers had to abandon the variable nature of liquids. They turned away from the unpredictable, temperature-sensitive behavior of water and looked toward a medium that could not freeze, would not evaporate, and did not harbor aquatic life. The steady movement of dry grains slipping reliably through the narrow throat of blown glass. Chapter 7. Sand between two glasses. The vulnerabilities of the water clock drove a search for a more reliable medium of measurement. As long as timekeepers relied on liquids, they remained at the mercy of the weather. A freeze could crack a stone reservoir, and a hot summer afternoon could accelerate evaporation, throwing calibrated hours into disarray. Furthermore, the organic nature of water encouraged algae and mineral deposits, which eventually choked narrow drainage holes. Engineers and artisans needed a substance that behaved like a fluid, but resisted the limitations of moisture and temperature. They found their solution in the dry friction of granular materials, captured within the sealed environment of blown glass. The sandglass, or hourglass, emerged as a practical, enclosed timer generally less vulnerable than an open water clock to freezing and evaporation. While its exact origins are obscured, the sandglass became widely recognized in European records and artwork during the 14th century. It offered a stark contrast to the complex water clocks of the Islamic world and the monastic clepsydras. Stripped of intricate gearing and floats, the sandglass was a minimalist instrument, consisting of two glass bulbs joined by a narrow throat, encased in a simple wooden or brass frame. Yet, within this simplicity lay a sophisticated understanding of material behavior and a growing mastery of glass production. The success of a sandglass depended heavily on the preparation of the material sealed inside. Ordinary sand, casually scooped from a beach, was useless for accurate timekeeping. It could contain irregular grains, fine dust, salt, and trapped moisture. If placed inside a glass, these impurities would inevitably clump, sticking to the walls or bridging across the narrow neck to halt the flow. To create a functioning timer, the material had to be processed with meticulous care. Artisans gathered specific types of fine sand, marble dust, or finely crushed eggshells. This raw material was washed to remove salt, then thoroughly dried in ovens to eliminate moisture. Finally, it was sifted through fine screens to achieve greater uniformity. The goal was to select grains of similar size and shape, ensuring a smooth, consistent flow. While achieving identical particles was impossible, rigorous sifting produced a granular medium that moved with reliable predictability. The physical behavior of these dry grains offered an advantage over water. In a clepsydra, as the water level drops, pressure decreases, causing the flow to slow and less complex mechanisms compensate. Granular materials behave differently. Because of the way dry particles stack and distribute their weight against the curved glass walls, the pressure at the narrow throat remains largely constant until the upper bulb is nearly empty. The sand slips through the aperture at a steady rate, unbothered by the shifting weight of the material above it. This allowed for a simple, accurate measure of duration. Early sandglasses were often constructed from two separate glass teardrops, carefully matched and joined at their tips. The seam was wrapped with cord and sealed with wax to keep out ambient humidity, the greatest enemy of dry sand. As glass-blowing techniques advanced, artisans learnt to fashion the instrument from a single piece of clear glass, shaping the bulbs and constricted neck over a flame. This seamless construction offered better protection against moisture and provided a smoother internal surface for the sand to traverse. The transparency allowed observers to see exactly how much material remained. On land, the sandglass found a place in workshops to measure the duration of a task, in kitchens to time the boiling of food, and in churches to pace the length of a sermon. It provided a visual representation of passing time that was easy to read from a distance. A congregation could watch the sand accumulating in the lower bulb and know how much longer the preacher intended to speak. It also took on cultural resonance, appearing frequently in art and literature as a sobering symbol of mortality and the fleeting, irreversible nature of human life. However, the sandglass found its most critical application far away from the parish church. It proved especially useful aboard ship, where the challenges of the open ocean rendered other timekeepers ineffective. A traditional sundial was difficult to read on a pitching deck, and useless under heavy overcast skies. The standard water clock was sensitive to motion. The rolling of the vessel would slosh the liquid, disrupting any measurement of flow rate. The sandglass was self-contained and less affected by the sway of the ship, and could continue working reasonably well despite ordinary ship motion. For mariners, measuring time was a matter of survival. Navigation out of sight of land relied heavily on dead reckoning. This method combined the ship's compass course, an estimated speed, and the elapsed time to calculate the vessel's position on a chart. If the measurement of time was inaccurate, the calculated position would be wrong. potentially leading a ship onto hidden reefs. To determine speed through the water, sailors utilized a chip log. This consisted of a weighted piece of wood attached to a long line with knots tied in it at regular intervals. When thrown overboard, it acted as a drogue, remaining relatively stationary as the ship moved forward, unspooling the line. To calculate speed, a sailor counted the knots that passed through his hands while a specialized sandglass ran its course. This navigational timer, known as a log glass, often ran around half a minute. Its specific interval was carefully matched to the spacing of the knots on the line, allowing the crew to directly translate the unspooled knots into nautical miles per hour. This practice gave maritime speed its enduring unit of measurement. The sandglass also regulated the rhythm of life on board. The ship's day was divided into distinct watches. A large sandglass, or a smaller half-hour glass turned multiple times, stood near the helm. When the sand finally ran out, the helmsman, or a designated boy, would turn the glass and strike the ship's bell, signaling the passage of time and the rotation of the crew. Back on land, the reliable nature of the sandglass allowed it to be scaled down for specific uses. By the 18th century, as medical practices sought more standardized measurements, physicians began to carry specialized, miniature sandglasses. The pulse glass allowed a doctor to measure a patient's heartbeats over a reliable short interval, usually 15 or 30 seconds, without needing a large clock or relying on a subjective internal count. Despite its elegance and durability, the sandglass harbored a significant limitation. It was strictly an interval timer. It did not tell the time of day, it only measured a specific duration from the moment it was inverted. Once the upper bulb was empty, the measurement ceased. The sandglass possessed no autonomous memory and no internal counting mechanism. It required a human hand to reset it and a human mind to tally how many times it had been turned. If a ship's boy fell asleep and missed the moment the last grain fell, the continuous chain of time was broken, rendering subsequent navigational calculations unreliable. Civic administration, commerce, and the expanding demands of the monastic schedule required a timekeeper that could track the passing of hours continuously, day and night, without relying on the constant vigilance of an operator. The fall of sand had solved the problems of weather and motion, but it could not provide an autonomous count. To create a machine that could tick endlessly forward on its own, engineers would have to experiment with the controlled release of heavy falling weights and the interlocking teeth of iron gears. Chapter 8. The candle's uncertain measure. Both water and sand relied on gravity pulling mass through a narrow opening to measure the passing hours. But early societies also possessed another elemental resource, fire. By harnessing the steady consumption of fuel, timekeepers created a distinct kind of interval timer. The candle clock and the incense seal measured time by the slow, continuous process of combustion, rather than by the shifting of physical particles. The creeping progress of a flame or a smoldering ember offered a visible, linear track of duration that possessed an advantage over the sundial or the sandglass. It provided its own illumination during the long hours of darkness. A typical candle functions essentially as a solid block of carefully shaped fuel, drawn up slowly through a wick and vaporized by the heat of the flame. If the wax is uniform and the wick is carefully spun, the candle burns at a relatively consistent rate. By marking the side of the taper with evenly spaced lines, an observer could track the passing time as the wax melted away. To add an auditory signal, users could insert small metal pins or heavy nails into the wax at specific intervals. When the flame reached a pin and melted the surrounding wax, the metal would fall into a brass or copper pan below, producing a sharp chime to mark a designated duration. This provided a simple alarm system that did not require the complicated mechanics of a water clock. The most famous European association with this method belongs to a later and uncertain tradition surrounding the 9th century English king, Alfred the Great. According to chronicles and biographical accounts compiled by writers living long after his reign had ended, the king sought a reliable, consistent way to divide his day between matters of state, religious devotion, and rest, regardless of the weather or the season. The story claims he ordered the creation of 6 specific candles, each 12 inches long and carefully marked at 1-inch intervals. Lit in sequence, one after the other, these 6 candles were said to last 24 hours, with each inch representing a specific fraction of the day. While the historical accuracy of this specific royal invention is debated among scholars, and the exact dimensions may be a later embellishment, the legend highlights the practical appeal of using a burning taper to organize a schedule indoors or through the long northern nights. For a candle clock to function effectively as a reliable domestic timer, the overall quality of the chosen materials mattered greatly. Common tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were the standard lighting source for ordinary households. However, tallow burned unevenly, smoked heavily, and was prone to sudden sputtering, making it a poor choice for measuring time. Beeswax, while not strictly required for a basic timer, would improve consistency significantly. It burned with a cleaner, steadier flame and melted at a more predictable rate. Because pure beeswax was an expensive material, the everyday use of highly calibrated candle clocks was generally limited to wealthy merchant households, large religious monasteries, or sprawling royal courts, where the ongoing cost of the fuel could be easily justified. Even with the finest wax and the most carefully braided wick, combustion timepieces faced a significant environmental challenge. The movement of ambient air, a draft from a poorly fitted window, a door opening in a cold stone hall, or even the passing movement of a servant could agitate the flame, causing the wax to melt faster than intended. The rate of combustion was sensitive to the local atmosphere. To protect the flame and stabilize the burn rate, candles used for timekeeping were sometimes enclosed in protective lanterns made of wood and thin panels of scraped horn. These enclosures helped shield the fire from sudden gusts, but they could not eliminate the subtle variations in oxygen and temperature that affected the speed of the melting wax. The candle remained an uncertain measure, a rough guide rather than a precision instrument. While Europe experimented with wax, timekeepers in East Asia developed sophisticated methods of measuring time through combustion, primarily using incense. In China, the incense seal clock became a refined instrument for tracking hours in temples and homes. Rather than relying on an open flame, this method used a specialized template to lay out a continuous, unbroken trail of powdered incense in intricate, geometric patterns within a shallow metal or wooden tray. Once ignited at one end, the powder smoldered slowly and steadily along the predetermined path. Because the incense burned as a glowing ember without an open flame, it was far less susceptible to drafts than a candle. The rate of consumption was highly predictable, provided the incense powder was ground to a uniform consistency and packed evenly into the tray. Different scents could be carefully placed at specific points along the geometric trail. As the slowly moving ember reached a new section of powder, the ambient fragrance in the room would shift, perhaps from rich sandalwood to sweet aloes wood. This allowed an observer or a studying scholar to tell the approximate time simply by noting the changing scent in the air, without ever needing to look directly at the clock itself. Small metal weights hung by silk threads could also be placed across the path. When the ember burned through the thread, the weight dropped into a gong below, serving as a reliable alarm. These various combustion clocks, whether burning shaped wax in a drafty English hall or smouldering powdered incense in a quiet Chinese study, provided a highly vital service. They allowed people to measure specific intervals of time indoors and overnight, functioning independently of the sun and avoiding the freezing issues that frequently plagued early water clocks in the dead of winter. They were portable, relatively simple to operate on a daily basis, and provided the welcome ancillary benefits of light and fragrance in a domestic space. Despite their ingenuity, however, candle and incense clocks shared a practical limitation with the sandglass. They were interval timers that eventually exhausted their fuel. A candle burned down to a puddle of wax. An incense trail inevitably turned to a line of grey ash. They possessed no autonomous counting mechanism and could not track the continuous flow of days and weeks. They required human intervention to light the next candle or carefully tamp a new trail of fragrant powder. If the caretaker fell asleep and the flame died, the measurement of time was lost, and the dark hours returned to an unmeasured void. This reliance on active human management points to a broader reality of pre-industrial life. Timekeeping in the dark was a conscious, deliberate effort. The night was not yet understood as a standardized, easily measured block of time, cleanly divided by a ticking machine resting quietly on a bedside table. It was a shifting, uncertain environment, where the boundaries of the hours were marked by the fading glow of an ember or the shortening of a wax taper. To maintain a sense of time through the night required vigilance and a steady supply of resources. As the candle burned low and the shadows stretched across the walls, the inhabitants of the medieval world were reminded of their vulnerability in the dark. The effort to measure the night with fire was just one part of a larger struggle to maintain order and awareness when the sun disappeared. The transition from the fading daylight to the heavy darkness brought a change in the human experience, forcing communities to rely on their ears, their local watchmen, and their fading fires to navigate the uncertain hours before dawn. Chapter 9. Night watches and broken sleep. When the sun slipped below the horizon in the pre-industrial world, darkness settled heavily upon the landscape. The transition to night marked the end of visible labor and a shift in daily routines. Without electric illumination, The dark was encompassing, claiming the forests, the fields, and the unpaved streets of towns. As twilight deepened, human activity drew inward. Shutters were bolted, doors barred, and the boundaries of the active world shrank to the immediate radius of a single rushlight or the faint glow of the household fire. Domestic livestock were gathered and secured in pens or ground-floor stalls, their presence offering valuable heat and an early warning against predators. In the towns, the closing of heavy timber gates at sunset was a practical act, a communal securing of the settlement. Anyone left outside those walls after the curfew bell was forced to wait for dawn or navigate the open road in the dark. Inside the home, the loss of sight prompted a shift in the senses. Hearing became the primary tether to the surrounding environment. A household in the night was rarely silent. It was alive with subtle, localized noises that the clamor of daylight usually masked. The wooden beams of a timber-framed house groaned and settled as the ambient temperature dropped. Mice scurried within the thatch, and the wind rattled poorly fitted shutters. Men and women lay in the dark, engaged in the quiet practice of household listening. They learnt to interpret the mundane creak of a cooling rafter or the rustle of livestock housed in adjacent stalls. This auditory vigilance was a practical consequence of living without abundant artificial light. A listener could identify the shifting weather or a passing neighbor by the sound of footsteps outside. Nighttime was a period where the rustle of a straw mattress and a distant church bell were the most immediate realities. To manage the vulnerabilities of the dark, communities organized formal systems of vigilance. The night watch was a staple of civic life, an obligation shared among the able-bodied men of the town. Divided into distinct rotations, these watches were a structured attempt to maintain order and provide a sense of security. The watchmen patrolled the lightless streets with lanterns, their heavy footsteps serving as a deterrent to disruption and a comfort to the wakeful. In larger merchant cities, these rotations involved groups carrying iron cressets filled with burning pitch, their fiery glow casting long shadows against the timbered facades. Their duties were twofold: to prevent the outbreak of fire, a persistent risk in wooden-built settlements, and to monitor those wandering the streets after curfew. In some regions, watchmen carried heavy wooden rattles, using these tools to communicate with neighboring patrols or to raise an alarm across a sleeping district. The hours of darkness were categorized into distinct shifts, often mirroring ancient military practices of dividing the night into 3 or 4 watches. The organization of these patrols fell to individual wards or parishes, with local householders taking turns to walk the boundaries of their neighborhoods. Some watchmen carried small sandglasses to pace their rounds, ensuring they covered assigned streets evenly before returning to a guardhouse to warm themselves. The changing of the watch marked time's passage, accompanied by the crying of the hour. A watchman's voice echoing down a cobbled street, announcing the time and weather, was a thread connecting isolated households to the broader community. Yet, the watch was not always reliable. Records note fines levied against men who fell asleep at their posts, hired inadequate substitutes, or abandoned their patrols for the warmth of a tavern. Despite these human failings, the institution of the watch underscored that the night was a territory requiring active management. The experience of resting through these guarded nights was likely different from the modern expectation of an unbroken 8-hour slumber. Historians and anthropologists have debated the phenomenon of segmented or biphasic sleep. A body of evidence suggests that in some pre-industrial societies, people commonly divided their nighttime rest into 2 distinct intervals. They would retire shortly after dusk, sleeping for several hours in what was sometimes termed the first sleep. This would be followed by a period of wakefulness lasting an hour or 2 in the dead of the night, before they returned to a second sleep that carried them through until dawn. This intervening period of wakefulness was not widely viewed as an affliction of insomnia, but as an expected part of the nocturnal rhythm. During this quiet interval, people might remain in bed, praying in the stillness or engaging in low conversation. Others might rise to tend to infants, perform minor chores by the dim light of the moon, or check on the livestock to ensure they were secure. Medical texts and agricultural manuals sometimes recommended this intermediate waking period as a time for quiet study or for digesting the heavy evening meal. The language of segmented sleep permeated diaries and literature, indicating its presence across various social strata. However, social class and occupation likely influenced this habit. Urban elites with access to beeswax candles might extend their evenings, altering this resting pattern, whereas rural laborers remained tethered to the natural darkness. Furthermore, the universality of this practice remains uncertain. While historical references describe segmented sleep, it is unclear if it was a biological default or a pragmatic adaptation to the long winter nights of northern latitudes. In the height of summer, with shortened nights and the grueling demands of agricultural labor, it is probable that exhausted peasants slept straight through until morning. This fluid experience of nighttime timekeeping, reliant on the town watch or the feeling of a first sleep ending, proved insufficient for the growing complexities of medieval society. The need to impose a stricter grid upon the dark hours arose primarily from the spiritual domain, before it became a commercial necessity. Within the austere walls of Christian monasteries, the observance of the divine office required monks to rise at specific, defined intervals throughout the night to chant the liturgy. The most demanding of these services, matins, occurred in the deep hours of the night. Waking a dormant community in the dark with regularity was a formidable logistical challenge. The person tasked with this duty, the monastic timekeeper, bore a heavy responsibility. If he overslept, the entire community missed their spiritual obligations. Sundials were useless without the sun, and the traditional water clocks were temperamental. A water clock might freeze on a bitter January night, or its flow rate might vary with the fluctuating temperature, rendering its measurements inaccurate just when they were most needed. The urgency to faithfully execute these nocturnal prayers, to measure the dark with an artificial metric, became a catalyst for technological innovation. The desire to divide unseen hours with the same certainty applied to daylight drove the pursuit of a new mechanism. The quiet, watchful nights, the rigid monastic schedules, and the civic necessity of the watch rotations converged into a pressing demand. It was out of this need to regulate the dark, to measure the unseen and the cold, without relying on the flow of water or the presence of the sun, that the intricate gears of the first mechanical public clocks began to turn. The solution would bypass water and sand, relying instead on descending weights controlled by the measured ticking of a mechanical escapement. This innovation would eventually culminate in a heavy, automated iron hammer striking a bronze bell high above the sleeping town, an unprompted, mechanical sound that forever changed how humanity experienced the night. Chapter 10. Wheels above the town. The automated iron hammer striking the bronze bell, operating without a human hand pulling a rope, signaled a turning point in how humanity measured duration. The origins of the European mechanical clock remain uncertain. There is no single recognized inventor or definitive date of creation. Historical evidence suggests that these machines emerged during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, likely serving a blend of monastic and civic needs. Within the monasteries, there was a pressing requirement to wake the brethren for nocturnal prayers, demanding a reliable alarm system that did not freeze in winter as water clocks often did. Simultaneously, growing mercantile cities needed dependable signals to regulate markets, coordinate labor, and manage the opening and closing of municipal gates. The mechanical clock arose as a practical solution to these overlapping challenges, offering an automated sound that could regulate the dark hours and the busy daylight alike. These early mechanisms were likely forged by local blacksmiths and locksmiths, artisans accustomed to working with heavy iron rather than delicate instruments. To achieve this automated strike, medieval engineers had to solve a difficult physical puzzle. They needed a source of power that would not exhaust itself too quickly, and they needed a way to control the release of that power. The solution began with gravity. A heavy iron or stone weight was attached to a thick rope which was wrapped around a wooden barrel. As gravity pulled the weight downward, it forced the barrel to turn. Left unchecked, the weight would plummet to the floor in seconds, spinning the barrel wildly and rendering the device useless. The critical invention that transformed this falling weight into a functional timekeeper was the escapement mechanism. The earliest known form of this mechanism was the verge and foliot. This consisted of a vertical iron rod, or verge, equipped with two small metal plates called pallets. This rod engaged with a specialized toothed wheel, often called the crown wheel, driven by the falling weight. As the wheel turned, one of its angled teeth pushed against a pallet, rotating the verge. This rotation swung a horizontal crossbar, the foliot, which had small weights hung on each end. The momentum of the swinging foliot soon caused the verge to swing back, releasing the first tooth and allowing the second pallet to catch a different tooth on the opposite side of the wheel. This back-and-forth action alternately arrested and released the descending weight. It broke the continuous fall into a series of measured, interrupted steps. By moving the small weights inward or outward along the folio arm, the keeper could adjust the speed of the swing, thereby regulating the clock. This mechanical hesitation produced the steady, rhythmic ticking sound that would become synonymous with the passage of time. It is important to recognize that the earliest mechanical clocks did not resemble the timepieces we know today. They possessed no dials, no hour hands, and no minute hands. They were blind machines, massive iron frameworks housed in dark towers, designed primarily to make a noise. The English word clock and the French cloche derive from the medieval Latin word clocca, meaning bell. The purpose of these early machines was to trigger an automated strike at specific intervals. They were acoustic instruments, built to broadcast a signal over the rooftops of a city or the fields of an abbey. A complex secondary train of gears, released by the main timekeeping mechanism, would lift a heavy hammer and let it fall against the rim of a large bell. Because they relied on heavy falling weights and the loud striking of bells, these early clocks required substantial architectural support. They were installed high in cathedral towers or purpose-built municipal belfries. The elevation served practical purposes. It gave the driving weights a long vertical shaft in which to descend, allowing the clock to run for many hours before needing to be rewound by hand, and it provided a high vantage point to project the sound of the bell across a wide radius. From these elevated positions, the ticking gears became a shared auditory reference for the entire surrounding community. The townspeople did not look up to read the time. They listened for it to echo down into the streets and market squares. The introduction of the mechanical clock initiated a gradual shift in how society understood the measurement of a day. For millennia, the unequal, seasonal hours dictated by the sun had guided human activity. A summer hour was long and a winter hour was short. But a mechanical escapement cannot easily replicate the organic, expanding and contracting rhythms of the solar year. The verge and foliot paced out a steady, unvarying rhythm. The machine naturally divided the day into equal segments, regardless of the season, the weather, or the available daylight. The mechanical hour was a fixed unit of duration. This transition from fluid, natural time to mechanical, equal time was not immediate. For many decades, the two systems coexisted. Sundials and unequal hours continued to govern agricultural work, while the mechanical bells began to dictate the civic and commercial schedules of the towns. The adoption of equal hours provided a stable framework for merchants arranging contracts and civic officials coordinating urban labor. It offered a standardized metric that did not change from December to June. A meeting scheduled for the third hour of the afternoon meant the same duration of elapsed time in the dead of winter as it did in the height of summer. Different regions experimented with how to count these equal hours, with some Italian cities counting from 1 to 24 starting at sunset, while northern European towns favored a system of two 12-hour cycles starting at midnight and noon. Despite the ingenuity of their design, these early medieval clocks were highly inaccurate machines. The heavy iron gears were filed by hand, resulting in significant friction. The lubricants available, usually animal fats or simple oils, thickened in cold weather and thinned in the heat, altering the resistance within the movement. The verge and foliot escapement was particularly sensitive to these changes, and a clock might easily gain or lose 15 to 30 minutes in a single day. Furthermore, the constant striking of the iron pallets against the crown wheel caused rapid wear, requiring frequent attention from a blacksmith. Because of this unreliability, the mechanical timekeeper was not a replacement for the sun. It remained dependent upon it. The human caretaker, often known as the keeper of the clock, had to regularly climb the tower to maintain and reset the machine. They relied on sundials and the observation of solar noon to correct the mechanical drift. The machine provided the steady interval and the automated alarm during the night or overcast days, but the sun remained the ultimate arbiter of accuracy. The massive iron wheels turning slowly in the dark towers provided a steady beat that operated independently of human fatigue. The sound of the automated bell echoing over the rooftops began to condition the urban population to a different rhythm, one based on equal, mechanical divisions rather than the organic shifting of daylight. Yet, this mechanical framework was still confined to the public sphere. The machine was a large, expensive piece of civic or religious infrastructure, housed in a tower and managed by specialists. It coordinated the masses through sound, but it was not something a person could own or interact with privately. The next technological challenge would involve taking these heavy iron gears and scaling them down, moving the measurement of equal hours out of the high belfries and bringing it closer to the individual inside the home and the private study. Chapter 11. Faces, Hands and Household Clocks. The massive iron mechanisms housed in municipal belfries and cathedral towers provided a shared, acoustic measure of time. Yet, these public clocks remained distant, communal infrastructure. They were managed by specialists and served the broad needs of the town or abbey. As the 14th century progressed into the 15th, a desire emerged to bring the measurement of equal hours closer to the individual. Wealthy merchants, scholars, and nobility sought a way to track the day within their own private spaces, without relying on the distant tolling of the town bell or the weather-dependent shadow of a sundial. To achieve this, clockmakers faced the challenge of scaling down the heavy architectural machinery of the tower clock into a device small enough to fit inside a domestic room. The most visible change in this transition was the addition of a dial. The earliest mechanical tower clocks were primarily blind, designed to strike a bell. When timekeeping moved indoors, it required a quiet, continuous visual display. The clock face provided this solution. Artisans painted or engraved numbers around a circular track, representing the 12 or 24 equal hours. To indicate the current time, a single metal pointer, the hour hand, was attached to a central arbor driven by the internal gears. This development shifted the human interaction with mechanical time from the ear to the eye. Instead of waiting for a bell to strike, a person could glance at the dial and see the progression of the day. The single hour hand moved with a slow, almost imperceptible creep, because early escapements were relatively inaccurate, often gaining or losing portions of an hour each day. There was no practical reason to divide the dial into smaller increments. A single hand indicating that it was past the third hour or approaching the fourth provided the precision the mechanism could reliably support and the detail a household typically required. Shrinking the mechanism presented a difficult engineering puzzle regarding power. Tower clocks relied on the gravitational pull of heavy stone or iron weights descending down a long vertical shaft. Inside a domestic room, space was limited. While some early domestic clocks continued to use small weights hanging from wall brackets, a true tabletop timepiece required a different energy source. During the 15th century, craftsmen developed the coiled mainspring. By tightly winding a ribbon of tempered steel around a central core, they could store mechanical energy. As the spring naturally tried to uncoil, it provided the rotational force needed to drive the gears. The mainspring allowed clocks to become portable, sitting neatly on a desk or a shelf. However, it introduced a new mechanical flaw. A coiled spring does not deliver power evenly. It pulls with great force when fully wound and weakens as it unwinds. For a verge and foliot escapement to keep steady time, it required a consistent driving force. If driven directly by a simple spring, the clock would run fast in the morning and slow down by the evening. To solve this, clockmakers developed compensating mechanisms. The most elegant was the fusee, a cone-shaped, grooved pulley connected to the mainspring barrel by a chain or cord. When the spring was fully wound and pulling at its strongest, the chain pulled on the narrowest part of the cone, giving it less mechanical leverage. As the spring unwound and weakened, the chain pulled on the wider base of the cone, increasing the leverage. This device equalized the force delivered to the clock's gears, allowing spring-driven timepieces to maintain a relatively steady rate. While the spring allowed for small, portable table clocks, weight-driven domestic clocks remained popular due to their simpler construction and reliable power delivery. These early domestic weight clocks appeared in the 15th and 16th centuries, typically hung high on a wall to allow the driving cords and small lead weights room to descend. As the craft expanded across Europe, distinct regional styles began to emerge, reflecting local tastes and metalworking traditions. Later, mainly in the 17th century, a specific style of weight-driven wall clock became a familiar fixture in prosperous English households, the lantern clock. It was constructed primarily of brass, a material that resisted rust and was easier to file and engrave than iron. The name likely derived from its shape, which resembled a traditional enclosed lamp, with 4 brass pillars supporting a top plate, surmounted by a prominent bell. The lantern clock typically featured a large, engraved chapter ring bearing the Roman numerals for the hours, and a single ornate iron hand. It hung from a sturdy hook on a wall, with its ropes and lead weights trailing down toward the floor. When the weights reached the ground, a member of the household would pull the ropes to raise them back up, resetting the clock's potential energy. These clocks were robust and visually striking, serving as functional centerpieces in the halls or parlors of merchants, lawyers, and successful craftsmen. The presence of a mechanical clock inside the home changed the texture of domestic life. It introduced a steady, rhythmic ticking that served as an auditory backdrop to everyday activities. The clock became a focal point of the room, an object of status that signaled the owner's wealth and their participation in the measured world. The maintenance of the clock, the daily winding of the spring, or the pulling of the weights, became a regular household ritual, tying the residents physically to the upkeep of their own schedule. The visual face of the clock also began to standardize the perception of time. The circular layout of the 12 hours became a widely recognized image. Time was conceptualized as a circle, a continuous loop that the single hand traced day after day. This spatial representation made the abstract concept of equal hours tangible. People could see how much time had passed and visually estimate how much remained until the next scheduled event, rather than relying solely on the feeling of elapsed duration or the angle of the sun. Despite their elegant brass dials and ingenious fusee mechanisms, these domestic clocks shared the same core limitation as their massive predecessors in the town squares. The early escapements were inherently susceptible to friction, wear, and changes in temperature. A well-made domestic clock of the 16th or early 17th century was still a loose estimator of the day. It provided a useful structure for a household, ensuring meals were served roughly on time and appointments were generally kept. But it could not dictate life with numerical exactitude. The single-hour hand was an honest reflection of the machine's capabilities. It pointed to the broad sweep of the hour, acknowledging the margin of error built into its own moving parts. The space between the hour marks on the brass dial was largely empty, perhaps divided into halves or quarters, but rarely finer. The minute remained a theoretical subdivision used by astronomers and mathematicians, not a practical unit of daily life. The domestic clock successfully brought the measurement of equal hours indoors, giving time a visible face and a pointing hand. It established the ticking machine as a central fixture of the prosperous home. Yet, the slow, creeping progress of the solitary hour hand could only satisfy the needs of society for so long. As commerce accelerated and scientific inquiry demanded greater exactitude, the mechanical limitations of the early escapements became a pressing barrier. The wide, quiet spaces between the painted numerals on the dial were waiting to be filled. To divide those spaces, clockmakers would have to rethink the heartbeat of the machine, paving the way for an innovation that would make the smallest fractions of an hour visible to the human eye. Chapter 12. Minutes become worth noticing. For centuries, the hour was the smallest unit of time that held practical meaning for the vast majority of the population. Tower clocks struck the hour, and daily life was loosely structured around these broad, 60-minute intervals. However, as the late 17th century bled into the 18th, the face of time began to change. A new hand appeared on the dials of domestic and public clocks, sweeping around the center with a rapid, unprecedented urgency. The minute hand, once a rare curiosity reserved for the precision instruments of astronomers, became a standard feature of the timekeeper. This mechanical addition reflected a shift in social reality. Minutes had finally become worth noticing. The appearance of the minute hand was driven by significant improvements in clockwork mechanisms. The integration of the pendulum for large clocks and the balance spring for portable watches transformed timekeeping. The pendulum, successfully applied in the mid-17th century, provided a regular harmonic oscillator. Because a swinging pendulum takes a consistent amount of time to complete each arc, clocks could finally track time to within a few minutes a week. Following closely, the balance spring brought similar stability to smaller timepieces, regulating the oscillation of a balance wheel. Once a machine could reliably maintain such a tight margin of error, dividing the hour into 60 distinct segments became a practical possibility. The dial grew more complex, with fine tick marks inviting citizens to measure their lives with newfound granularity. To understand how this mechanical precision shaped society, we can examine the rise of the commercial stagecoach enterprise. A journey between towns had long been an imprecise affair. A coach might leave roughly in the morning and arrive sometime before dusk. But as road conditions improved through the establishment of turnpike trusts in the 18th century, the volume of intercity commerce expanded. Stagecoach companies found themselves competing on the basis of speed and reliability. The coachmaster emerged as a central figure in the enforcement of strict schedules. Running a profitable fleet of horses and carriages across a network of towns required a strict ledger of time. For the coachmaster, a delayed departure meant a cascade of logistical complications. Horses waiting at relay stations grew cold. Passengers expecting connections were stranded, and mail bags, increasingly carried by these coaches, missed their transfers. Consequently, stagecoach enterprises began to publish exact timetables. A coach would no longer depart casually at sunrise, but at increasingly precise published departures. This institutional demand for punctuality encouraged the towns along the coaching routes to adapt. Innkeepers, ostlers, and local merchants found it beneficial to synchronize their activities with the regular schedule of the arriving and departing coaches. The stagecoach company effectively carried the exacting standards of the minute hand from urban centers out into the provincial countryside, linking distant towns into a tighter web of coordinated movement. This tighter temporal framework quickly permeated the broader world of commerce. The provincial merchant, who relied on the coachmaster's prompt deliveries, began to view time as an asset that could be managed or spent. In earlier periods, a business agreement might be forged over a leisurely afternoon, with the exact time of meeting left deliberately vague. Now, with the increasing speed of communication and the growing complexity of credit networks, coordination required a tighter schedule. Merchants began to arrange appointments for specific quarters of the hour. Being noticeably late to the coffee house to sign a contract was increasingly seen as a breach of professional trust. Time was becoming inextricably linked with money and reliability. Punctuality emerged as a recognizable virtue of the rising middle class, reflecting a disciplined approach to trade and negotiation. The pocket watch, newly equipped with its own minute hand, became an essential accessory of the successful businessman. Advances in manufacturing techniques allowed these devices to become somewhat more accessible, transitioning gradually from rare aristocratic novelties to practical tools for prosperous tradesmen. The watch was a tool for navigating a schedule of appointments, and it also functioned as a subtle signal that the owner's time was valuable and actively managed. When two merchants met on a busy street and pulled out their watches to compare the time, they engaged in a shared ritual of temporal alignment. They affirmed their participation in a society operating on the strict accounting of minutes. The ticking device in a waistcoat pocket served as a constant, private reminder of the passing day. As adult life became more closely governed by this schedule, the preparation of children increasingly involved regular school timetables. Education had previously been a fluid arrangement, governed by daylight and the availability of a tutor. As formal schools expanded, they adopted stricter schedules, broken down into precise blocks of instructional time. The ringing of the school bell began to punctuate the hours and the halves. Educators emphasized that tardiness was a failing of character. Attendance records noted late arrivals, and discipline was dispensed for failures of punctuality alongside academic shortcomings. By regimenting the daily lives of students, schools effectively socialized the next generation into the expectations of a minute-driven society. Such routines helped familiarize pupils with punctuality increasingly expected in many workplaces and public institutions. The change remained gradual, uneven, and dependent on local resources and custom. This growing focus on punctuality was not universally embraced. Many resisted the pressure of the minute hand, clinging to the forgiving, task-oriented rhythms of the past. Agricultural laborers, whose work remained dictated by the sun and the weather, viewed the urban fixation on minutes with skepticism. Even within towns, some independent artisans resented the intrusion of strict schedules, preferring to measure their day by the goods they produced, rather than the ticking of a dial. Yet, the momentum of the era remained on the side of the clock. The institutions embracing strict timekeeping, the stagecoach companies, merchant houses, and academies, were the entities driving economic and social change. To participate fully in this modernizing commercial world, individuals found it increasingly necessary to submit to its exacting schedule. The consequences of this shift were substantial. By dividing the hour into 60 distinct units, society magnified the perceived capacity of the day. A person planning their activities to the minute could arrange more interactions into a single afternoon than someone measuring life by the broad strokes of the sun. This increased density of experience fueled the dynamism of the 18th century, allowing for faster communication and a general acceleration of life's pace. It also introduced a recognizable modern anxiety, the feeling of being pressed for time, of rushing to catch a departing coach, or of running slightly behind schedule. Time was no longer just the environment in which life happened. It was a resource that was constantly slipping away. The integration of the minute hand into the fabric of daily life laid the groundwork for what was to come. Merchants and transport networks had demonstrated the economic power of strict scheduling and precise coordination. However, this coordination was still largely external. It governed the movement of goods between places and the meetings of individuals in public spheres. The next step was to apply this temporal discipline to the physical labor of the population. As the 18th century drew to a close, a new kind of institution began to rise, one that would demand exactitude from its laborers. The mechanisms of the clock were poised to merge with heavy machinery. The era of the coordinated coach network was ending, and the age of the factory whistle was about to begin. Chapter 13. The Factory Bell and the Working Day. The transition from the merchant's ledger to the factory floor marked a significant shift in the human relationship with time. In the agricultural and artisanal worlds, labor was generally task-oriented, guided by the sun and the completion of physical chores. The commercial era of stagecoaches and coffee house appointments had introduced the necessity of the minute hand for external coordination, ensuring that people met at agreed moments. However, the rise of industrial manufacturing in the late 18th and 19th centuries brought the mechanical clock directly into the center of the working day. As textile mills expanded, driven first by water wheels and later by steam engines, the machinery required a closely coordinated workforce. A steam engine could not run efficiently if a portion of the laborers arrived at the third hour and the rest at the fourth. The textile mill demanded synchronization across many individuals simultaneously. Consequently, the employer's purchase of labor shifted conceptually. Instead of buying a completed product, such as a woven cloth, the factory owner purchased a specific block of a worker's time. This new economic arrangement required a reliable method to signal the boundaries of the working day to a large population. The traditional parish bells were soon joined by the factory bell, and eventually, the sharp blast of the steam whistle. These new auditory signals cut through the noise of the growing industrial towns, serving as a daily summons to the mill. The sounding of the morning bell indicated exactly when the gates would open and, more importantly, when they would close. For the industrial worker, arriving before the gates shut became a daily priority. Lateness was no longer a flexible concept accommodated by the natural rhythms of a household. It was an economic infraction. Factories instituted strict rules regarding punctuality, where arriving even a few minutes after the bell could result in a recorded tardiness and a corresponding deduction in wages. The physical gates of the mill served as a hard boundary between personal time and the employer's time. Inside the factory walls, the clock acted as a continuous regulator of activity. The transition to hourly or daily wages meant that time was directly quantified as money. Overseers monitored the pace of work, and the mechanical timekeeper mounted prominently on the wall provided the objective standard by which a day's labor was measured. This system introduced a level of discipline that was distinct from the flexible rhythms of the farm or the independent artisan's workshop. In a traditional setting, a weaver working at home might take a rest in the afternoon and work later into the evening to finish a piece. In the factory, the machinery ran at a steady, continuous pace, and the workers were expected to match that mechanical rhythm for the duration of their shift. The structure of the day became rigidly compartmentalized into periods of continuous labor, separated by designated, timed breaks for meals. The flexibility of task-oriented time was replaced by strict adherence to the schedule indicated on the dial. The enforcement of this temporal discipline was achieved through detailed workplace regulations and economic incentives. Mill owners published lists of rules and fines for various infractions, with lateness being one of the most consistently penalized offenses. A worker who was 5 or 10 minutes late might lose the equivalent of an hour's pay, a policy designed to encourage strict compliance with the morning bell. The purpose of these wage deductions was primarily structural, ensuring the continuous operation of the expensive machinery. Idle machines represented lost capital, so the workforce had to be present and active the moment the central power was engaged. This economic logic transformed the minute hand from a tool of mere convenience into a strict measure of economic value. The timekeeper's ledger became a central document in the administration of the factory, meticulously tracking hours worked, breaks taken, and minutes lost. Workers did not simply adapt to this new regime without response or resistance. The factory clock frequently became a site of negotiation and friction between labor and management. Because factory clocks could drift, be poorly maintained, or be set by management, the official time on the factory wall was sometimes contested. Workers occasionally suspected that employers manipulated the dials, setting the clock forward in the morning to hasten the start of the shift, and slowing it in the evening to extract extra minutes of labor. While the prevalence of such deliberate manipulation is difficult to quantify from the historical record, the widespread suspicion highlights a significant social dynamic. The measurement of time was a point of active contention. The master's clock was viewed as an instrument of authority, and its accuracy was a matter of vital economic interest to the people working beneath it. They questioned its authority and sought ways to hold it accountable. To counter this reliance on the employer's timepiece, workers increasingly sought to acquire their own means of telling time. The 19th century saw a gradual democratization of the pocket watch. As manufacturing techniques improved and prices slowly fell due to mass production methods, a reliable watch became a highly desired possession for a factory worker. Owning a watch was a practical tool for ensuring one arrived at the gates on time and avoided wage deductions, but it also carried significant symbolic weight. It offered a measure of personal autonomy. A worker with a watch could verify the accuracy of the factory bell, monitor the exact length of their designated meal break, and challenge perceived discrepancies in the timekeeper's ledger. The proliferation of affordable watches meant that temporal awareness was no longer restricted to the wealthy merchant or the civic official. It was becoming a common feature of the working class, a necessary adaptation to an economy where minutes were directly tied to livelihoods. The strict division of the day into working hours and off hours reshaped the broader cultural understanding of daily life. In task-oriented societies, work and leisure were often intertwined naturally. A farmer might repair tools while sitting by the evening fire, or a spinner might socialize with neighbors while working the wheel at their own pace. The factory system severed this connection. When a worker was on the floor, their time was dedicated exclusively to the operation of the machines. Conversely, when the evening bell rang and the gates opened, the remaining time belonged to the worker. This clear demarcation gave rise to the modern concept of leisure time. Because the hours outside the factory were clearly defined and limited, they gained a new cultural value. Workers sought ways to spend this designated free time, contributing to the growth of organized sports, public parks, and reading rooms. The mechanical clock, by strictly defining the hours of labor, helped create the distinct category of the evening or the weekend off. The factory system established a strict temporal discipline within the walls of the mill, and the pocket watch allowed workers to navigate this demanding schedule with a degree of agency. However, this synchronization remained essentially local. The factory clock governed the town, but it was still set to the local solar time of that specific community. A mill in Manchester operated on Manchester time, while a London factory operated on London time, maintaining a natural difference of several minutes. As long as travel was limited to the speed of a horse-drawn coach, these local variations caused little disruption. But the same steam engines that powered the looms were soon mounted on iron wheels and rails. The emergence of the railway network would demand a level of synchronization that extended far beyond the factory gates. As locomotives traveled faster than the sun, the scattered local times of independent towns would collide, creating a logistical puzzle that required a unified, national solution. Chapter 14. Railways and the Agreement of Time. For centuries, time was an inherently local phenomenon. A town's clock was set to its specific solar noon, the moment the sun crossed the local meridian. Because the Earth rotates continuously, solar noon arrives at different moments, depending on a location's longitude. When it is noon in London, it is roughly 10 minutes before noon in Bristol, and further west in Cornwall, the difference stretches to nearly 20 minutes. As long as travel was limited to the speed of a horse-drawn carriage or a walking pedestrian, these local variations caused little friction. A stagecoach journey took days, and passengers naturally adjusted their pocket watches upon arrival at their destination. However, the introduction of the steam locomotive in the early 19th century altered the relationship between distance and time. Trains traveled fast enough to cross multiple lines of longitude in a single afternoon. This unprecedented speed transformed local time into a pressing logistical challenge for the growing railway networks. Operating a railway safely required strict scheduling. Early train networks often relied on single tracks, where trains traveling in opposite directions had to pass each other at designated sidings. If a train failed to reach a siding at the expected moment, the risk of serious accidents increased significantly. Preventing these collisions required urgent coordination between stations and conductors. Yet, coordinating a schedule was incredibly difficult when every station along the line operated on its own local solar time. A timetable stating a train would arrive at a specific hour meant little if the departure and arrival stations disagreed on the current time. Conductors carried watches set to the time of their headquarters, leading to constant calculations as they moved down the line. The discrepancy between the train's internal schedule and the town's public clocks created a confusing environment for both the railway operators trying to maintain safety and the passengers attempting to board a departing locomotive. To resolve this logistical puzzle, railway companies began to establish their own unified time standards. A notable early shift occurred in Britain in November 1840, when the Great Western Railway mandated that a single standard time be applied across its entire network. The company chose London time, specifically Greenwich Mean Time, as the official standard for all its timetables and station clocks, regardless of their actual geographic location. The time in a station in Bristol or Reading was no longer dictated by the sun overhead, but by an administrative decision originating in London. In these early years, synchronization was achieved manually. Conductors were issued highly accurate pocket watches, which they synchronized carefully in London before departure, and used to set the public clocks at each station along the route as they travelled. While the Great Western Railway's manual synchronization was a practical step, Maintaining unified time across a sprawling network remained difficult. The technology that enabled wider, regular synchronization emerged later with the expansion of the electric telegraph. The telegraph allowed a signal to be transmitted almost instantaneously over vast distances. Railway companies quickly recognized its potential for timekeeping. By running telegraph wires alongside the tracks, a central headquarters or an astronomical observatory could send an electronic pulse down the line at a specific hour, allowing station masters hundreds of miles apart to adjust their clocks to the exact same moment. The telegraph provided the vital nervous system for a synchronized network, ensuring that the agreement of time was a daily verifiable reality, rather than a rough approximation dependent on a conductor's traveling watch. The challenges faced in Britain were magnified on the North American continent. The vast east-west expanse of the United States and Canada meant that differences in solar time were measured in hours rather than minutes. As railway networks expanded westward, the scheduling situation became unwieldy. Because there was no centralized government mandate for a national time, individual railway companies established their own standards, usually based on the solar time of their headquarters or a major terminal. This resulted in a confusing patchwork of numerous railroad standards operating simultaneously across the continent. A major transit hub like Pittsburgh or Chicago might have multiple clocks on the station wall, each displaying a different railway time, alongside another clock showing the local city time. Passengers attempting to transfer between competing railway lines faced a complex puzzle to ensure they did not miss connections. The need for a streamlined system became evident to the railway operators. In November 1883, following extensive planning by executives and meteorologists, the North American railroads instituted a comprehensive system of time zones. Rather than each company maintaining its own time, the continent was divided into distinct regions. This agreement established 4 principal U.S. zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific, and an additional intercolonial zone in eastern Canada. Within each zone, all railway operations would function on a single, shared time, set exactly an hour apart from the neighboring zones. On the 18th of November 1883, railway clocks were reset according to the new standard observed within each zone. It was a remarkable feat of corporate coordination, prioritizing the efficiency of the network over the astronomical reality of local geography. The imposition of railway time did not occur without social friction. For many communities, adopting a standard time meant abandoning the local solar noon they had observed for generations. A town located on the western edge of a new time zone might find its clocks running half an hour ahead of the sun. Some civic leaders resisted, arguing that time was a natural phenomenon governed by the local sky, not a corporate metric dictated by distant railway executives. In certain municipalities, 2 times were kept for years: the traditional local time for civic functions and the standard time for catching trains. However, the economic and practical advantages of the railway network were undeniable. Commerce, mail delivery, and travel were tied to train schedules. Gradually, the convenience of a unified standard overcame the desire for local autonomy, and railway time became the accepted civil time. This agreement of time reshaped the public understanding of the clock. Time was increasingly viewed as a standardized system applied over the landscape, rather than a unique relationship between a specific town and the sun. The synchronized clocks at the railway stations became the authoritative arbiters of the hour. People adjusted their pocket watches, not by looking at a sundial, but by checking the station dial. The railway network, supported by the instantaneous signals of the telegraph, had successfully decoupled civil time from local astronomy. The hour was no longer a geographic variable, it was an agreed-upon convention, maintained by technology and administrative policy. This unified approach allowed for a level of coordination that fueled the industrial and commercial expansion of the late 19th century. The success of the railway time zones demonstrated the practical benefits of broad temporal standardization. Yet, this achievement was largely limited to regional and national networks. The North American agreement had organized a continent, and Britain had synchronized its islands, but these systems remained disconnected from one another on a global scale. As steamships began to cross the oceans with greater speed and international telegraph cables connected continents, the need for a wider agreement became pressing. The logic that had unified the towns along a railway line was now being applied to the nations of the world. The effort to coordinate timetables and navigation on a planetary scale would lead to a search for a single, universal starting point for time, setting the stage for international conferences and the establishment of a global meridian. Chapter 15. The clock inside everyday life. As international agreements established a global meridian and railways synchronized vast continents, a parallel shift occurred on a much smaller scale. The unified system of time, once the concern of astronomers, navigators, and railway executives, gradually filtered down into the private lives of ordinary citizens. The 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the democratization of the timekeeper. The mechanical clock, which had begun as a massive iron mechanism in a municipal tower and evolved into an expensive brass fixture for wealthy households, became a common personal possession. This transition was driven by changes in manufacturing and commerce, reshaping how individuals navigated their daily routines. Yet, as the ticking dial entered the pockets and homes of the broader public, it did not erase older ways of living. The integration of mechanical time into everyday life was a gradual blending of schedules, where the exacting demands of the minute hand operated alongside the persistent rhythms of the natural world and the task-oriented day. The primary engine of this change was the revolution in manufacturing. For centuries, clock and watchmaking had been a slow, artisanal craft. Highly skilled individuals hand-filed gears and fitted bespoke escapements, meaning each timepiece was unique and expensive. In the 19th century, clockmakers, particularly in the United States, began to adopt the system of interchangeable parts. Factories in Connecticut started producing standardized wooden, and later brass, gears stamped out by machinery. This approach drastically reduced the labor required to build a clock. The same principles were soon applied to the pocket watch. Companies like the American Watch Company in Waltham, Massachusetts, engineered specialized machines capable of producing identical watch components in large quantities. Instead of one craftsman building a watch from start to finish, the work was divided among hundreds of workers operating precision machinery, each creating a single standardized part. This industrial approach transformed the timepiece from a luxury item into a mass-market commodity. A reliable pocket watch, which had previously been a marker of significant wealth, became increasingly affordable to many wage earners. The famous dollar watch, introduced by the Waterbury Clock Company and popularized by Ingersoll in the late 1890s, was a heavy, durable instrument designed for the working public. It featured a thick stamped case and an unjeweled movement that kept reasonable time. It was cheap enough that a laborer, a farmer, or a clerk could purchase one without severe financial strain. Mail-order catalogs carried these affordable watches to rural addresses, ensuring that those living far from urban centers could participate in this temporal framework. The widespread availability of these watches meant that a person no longer had to rely on the factory whistle, the town bell, or the distant station clock to know the hour. They could carry the standardized measurement of time with them, consulting it at their own discretion in the fields or on the factory floor. The personal watch became an essential tool for navigating a society that increasingly relied on coordinated schedules. It allowed individuals to manage their own punctuality, arriving at the railway station before the train departed, or reaching the factory gates before the morning bell concluded. Beyond its practical utility, the pocket watch also served as a subtle social indicator. While the wealthy might carry thin, intricately engraved gold watches attached to heavy chains, a working man carried a robust nickel-cased timepiece. Both instruments, however, connected their owners to the same shared grid of civil time. People organized their days with an eye on the dial, pacing their walk to work, or timing their lunch break to ensure they returned precisely when expected. As the 20th century progressed, the pocket watch gave way to the wristwatch. Initially viewed as a fragile piece of women's jewelry or a novelty, the wristwatch proved its practical value in the trenches of the First World War, where soldiers needed to synchronize maneuvers without fumbling in their heavy coats. Military use during the First World War accelerated the wristwatch's acceptance among men, building on trends already underway before the war, and the style spread further through civilian populations. A glance at the wrist was faster and more discreet than pulling a watch from a pocket, further integrating the measurement of time into the physical posture of daily life. The ticking machine was now strapped directly to the body. It is tempting to view this proliferation of personal timepieces as the moment when mechanical time commanded every hour of the day, overriding all other experiences. However, historical reality was more nuanced. While the synchronized clock governed the railway timetable, the school day, and the factory shift, it did not dictate the entirety of life. Natural and task-oriented rhythms persisted alongside this new synchronization. In agricultural communities, the harvest still depended on the weather and the available daylight, regardless of what the pocket watch indicated. A farmer might consult a watch to know when the mail train was due in town, but the timing for milking cows or cutting hay remained tied to biological and ecological realities. During the winter, the pace of rural life naturally slowed as the days shortened, resisting the uniform mechanical hours ticking away in the parlor. Even within the industrialized cities, the domestic sphere often operated on a mixed schedule. While a factory worker adhered strictly to the clock during their shift, their time at home involved tasks governed by duration and necessity rather than exact minutes. Cooking, cleaning, and caring for children followed an internal logic of completion. The local baker still judged the readiness of bread by its color and sound. A neighborhood tailor worked until the garment was finished or the light failed in the window. Sunday often remained a day when the strict observation of the minute hand was relaxed, allowing families a brief respite from the organized schedule of the working week. The mechanical clock provided a rigid framework for public and commercial coordination, but it did not extinguish the organic pace of localized, task-based living. The two systems coexisted, requiring people to adapt and switch between the numerical precision of the dial and the practical demands of the physical world. Nevertheless, the constant presence of the clock gradually shifted cultural expectations. Punctuality became a widely recognized social norm across broader segments of society. Arriving on time for a meeting, a church service, or a social engagement demonstrated respect for another person's schedule. The language of time management permeated everyday conversation, with time described as a resource that could be saved, spent, or wasted. This awareness of the passing minutes introduced a persistent sense of urgency into modern life. People learnt to segment their days into distinct blocks, allocating specific durations to work, travel, and leisure. The ability to monitor time personally meant that individuals internalized the discipline that had previously been enforced by the external ringing of the town bell. Schools played a crucial role in this process, using classroom clocks and scheduled bells to naturalize the rhythm of the minute hand for the next generation, preparing them for an adult life structured by appointments and shifts. The journey from the shadow of the Egyptian obelisk to the ticking watch on a wrist reflects a long, evolving attempt to understand duration. Humanity moved from reading the shifting, silent arcs of the sun to capturing the steady flow of water and sand, eventually mastering the intricate fall of heavy iron weights and the tight coil of a steel spring. The clock became an indispensable feature of everyday life, providing the necessary structure for global coordination. Yet, even as we check our wrists or screens to navigate a highly synchronized world, the older rhythms remain. We still wake to the morning light, grow tired as darkness falls, and feel the turning of the seasons, living simultaneously within the measured ticking of the machine and the quiet, enduring cycles of the natural earth.